Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
In 2003, I lived in a small town in southern Oregon, nestled between rolling hills and dense evergreen forests. My husband, Derek, had recently left active military service, and we were adjusting to civilian life with our 4-year-old daughter, Ella. Life felt quieter, slower, until that one evening an unsettling experience left a permanent mark on my memory. It was Ella's birthday the next day, and I wanted to make it special. She had been asking for a butterfly-themed party for weeks. After work, I realized I hadn't picked up decorations yet. With dusk settling in, I decided to head to a small party supply store on the edge of town. It wasn't one of those big chain stores, just a cozy little shop tucked into an aging strip mall. The kind of place where you could still find handwritten price tags and creaky wooden floors. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only 3 cars sat scattered under the dim glow of the streetlights. My beat-up sedan, another nondescript car parked near the far end, and an older white van with tinted windows parked uncomfortably close to the entrance. I felt a flicker of unease but brushed it off. Small-town paranoia, I told myself. Inside, the store was bright and almost painfully quiet. A cheerful young woman with short brown hair and glasses greeted me from behind the counter. Her name tag read, Claire. She seemed about 20, maybe working here to save up for college. She looked up briefly from a magazine she was reading and smiled. "Let me know if you need help finding anything," she chirped. I wandered the aisles, grabbing butterfly balloons, streamers, and a paper banner. The whole time, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I glanced around, but the store was empty except for Claire and me. I chalked it up to nerves and hurried to the register. Claire scanned my items while chatting lightly about the weather. Through the large front windows, I noticed the van still parked out there. Its engine wasn't running, but 2 silhouettes sat in the front seats. The driver's face was partially visible, illuminated by the flicker of a cigarette. He wasn't just sitting there, he was staring at us. "That van," I blurted out, motioning toward the window. "Has it been here long?" Claire shrugged. "Maybe." I wasn't really paying attention. She didn't seem concerned. I paid quickly and left, though I lingered just inside the door, pretending to check my receipt. The men in the van didn't move, but I felt their eyes on me as I walked to my car. My pulse quickened when the passenger door cracked open slightly. The man inside adjusted his seat, leaning forward like he was considering stepping out. I gripped my keys tightly, unlocking my car as I walked. Once I got in, I locked the doors immediately and started the engine. I told myself to leave, but something held me back. Claire was still inside, completely unaware of the men watching her. As I sat there, torn between staying and going, I saw her turn off the lights inside the store. She grabbed her bag, walked to the door, and locked it behind her. She never looked up, not once. The men in the van perked up, shutting their doors quietly as the van's headlights flickered on. They began rolling slowly toward her, their intentions painfully clear. My heart raced. I couldn't just sit there. Without thinking, I threw my car into reverse and drove straight toward her. I pulled up right next to Claire, practically hugging the curb. She didn't even flinch, didn't glance my way, just walked steadily toward her car like nothing was wrong. Her calmness unsettled me. Did she not see the van? Couldn't she feel their presence? The van stopped abruptly, its occupants visibly frustrated. One of the men gestured angrily, but I didn't care. I stayed beside her the entire way to her car, effectively blocking them from getting close. Claire unlocked her car, climbed in, and drove off as if it were any other night. She never looked back, not at me, not at the van. I watched her taillights fade before turning my attention to the van. They lingered a moment longer, as if debating their next move. Then, without warning, they sped off in the opposite direction. I sat there for a while, shaking and trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I drove home, my mind spinning with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Looking back, I regret not calling the police or the store's management the next day. Maybe I thought it wasn't my place, or maybe I was just too shaken to think straight. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stayed. Would Claire have been safe? Would anyone have known what became of her? Even now, whenever I see a white van in a parking lot, my stomach tightens, and that uneasy feeling creeps back in. Some moments, even years later, refuse to fade. It was a few years back, just after my 20th birthday. I had just moved to a new city for college, a fresh start in every sense. Being an introvert, I was still trying to adjust to the chaos of dorm life and the whirlwind of social circles. One night, a group of classmates invited me out to celebrate a classmate's birthday at a local hangout spot. It wasn't my scene, but I decided to step out of my comfort zone and join them. The evening started off harmless enough: music, chatter, and too many drinks. By midnight, the crowd had thinned out, and I felt a little disconnected. My roommate, who had promised to stick by me, left with her boyfriend, leaving me stranded at the bar. I was irritated, but decided to stay a little longer, convincing myself that I deserved a rare night out. Around 1 a.m., as the bar started to clear, I struck up a conversation with the bartender. He was friendly, and we laughed about the absurdity of the crowd. Then, a guy slid onto the bar stool next to me, someone I hadn't noticed earlier. He looked older, mid-30s maybe, but carried himself with a charm that made him seem approachable. He introduced himself as James and mentioned it was his birthday. We talked for a while, and I'll admit his attention felt nice. He even bought me another drink, and I foolishly let my guard down. As the night went on, he offered to give me a ride back to my dorm, saying it wasn't safe for me to take an Uber alone this late. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. The streets were quiet as we walked to his car, and although something about it didn't sit right, I brushed off my unease as overthinking. Once in the car, I gave him directions to my dorm, but he seemed distracted, asking me repeatedly if I was sure about the route. Then, without warning, he took a right turn instead of the left I'd instructed. My pulse quickened, but I didn't want to let on that I was panicking. "This isn't the right way," I said with a forced laugh. He ignored me, keeping his eyes on the road. I tried to stay calm, pretending to scroll on my phone while discreetly taking pictures of him and the interior of the car. The further we drove, the more my surroundings became unfamiliar. When he pulled into a dimly lit apartment complex, my heart sank. "We're here," he said casually. "Here," I stammered. "I thought you were taking me home." "You can use the bathroom inside," he said, stepping out of the car and gesturing toward one of the buildings. I knew I couldn't follow him inside. Every instinct in me screamed that if I did, I might not make it out. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle. The moment he turned his back, I bolted. I ran blindly, my breath coming in short gasps as I darted between parked cars and across empty streets. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. My phone buzzed weakly in my hand, the battery icon flashing red. I had just enough power to open the map app, but it was useless. I had no idea where I was. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a house with its porch light still on. Desperation overrode any fear of knocking on a stranger's door. A dog barked inside, and moments later an older couple appeared. Their concern was immediate. They ushered me inside, let me charge my phone, and even called a cab for me. By the time I made it back to my dorm, it was nearly 4 a.m. I sat on my bed, shaking and replaying the night over and over in my head. I didn't sleep at all, and when I finally texted my roommate, her delayed and dismissive response made me realize how little she cared. A few weeks later, she had the audacity to ask if she could use my story for her creative writing assignment. She wanted to pretend it had happened to her. I couldn't believe it. That night wasn't some thrilling anecdote. It was a nightmare I was still trying to process. Since then, I've made better choices. I've found friends who actually care, and I've started therapy to work through the lingering fear. That night taught me lessons I wish I didn't have to learn the hard way. Trust your instincts. Speak up when something feels off. And for the love of everything, don't get into a stranger's car. It's a dangerous world out there. Stay safe. In 2017, when I was about 14, I spent most of my free time with my best friend, Ethan. We were inseparable, always finding something fun, or, stupid, to do. Ethan lived just a few houses down the street from mine, and we had this unspoken rule of alternating sleepovers. Most nights were spent gaming, watching action movies, or sneaking out to explore the neighborhood when the world was asleep. That year, Ethan and I both got ghillie suits for our birthdays. If you don't know what those are, think of camouflage suits that make you look like a walking pile of leaves or grass. We thought they were the coolest things ever. One night, after spending hours laughing at how ridiculous we looked in those suits, Ethan suggested we put them to use. That's when we came up with the idea of Ding Dong ditching the infamous Old Man Riggs. Old Man Riggs was the neighborhood recluse. Every block has one, right? The house where the blinds are always shut, the lawn is a little too overgrown, and the owner seems like they've got secrets. Rumors swirled about him. Some kids said he used to be in the military. Others claimed they saw him burying something in his backyard late one night. I wasn't sure what was true, but Ethan swore Riggs once tried to break into his dad's car. Riggs' house was perfect for our plan. It sat at the edge of a small patch of woods, with an unfinished lot on one side, and an overgrown path leading to the backyards of nearby houses. The woods were our playground, and we knew them better than anyone. The idea was simple. I'd ring Riggs's doorbell, then run to the woods where Ethan would be watching from a safe distance. We'd meet up on the trail and head back home, laughing all the way. Things didn't go as planned. As I crept up to the front door, heart pounding in my chest, I felt a rush of adrenaline. But before I could press the doorbell, the door flew open with a loud creak. My stomach dropped. Standing there were two men. One of them I recognized as Riggs. The other was younger, maybe in his 30s, with a wiry frame and wild eyes. Without a word, they lunged toward me. I bolted, my legs moving faster than they ever had. I didn't even have time to look back. All I knew was that Ethan was on the other side of the property, and I had to warn him. But as I sprinted toward the woods, I caught a glimpse of the second man veering off in Ethan's direction. Panic set in. "Ethan, run!" I screamed, hoping he'd hear me. Instead of heading deeper into the woods, Ethan made a mistake. He ran down the narrow trail we'd carved behind the neighborhood. It was a straight shot, but it was boxed in by fences on either side. A dead end if anyone got too close. I realized I was in trouble too. Riggs was behind me, and the other guy was ahead, closing in on Ethan. I had to think fast. I veered off the trail, scaling the fence into Riggs's backyard. It seemed like a terrible idea at first, but it gave me a chance to lose him. As soon as I landed on the other side, a wave of stench hit me so hard that I gagged. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, and froze. The backyard was a nightmare. There were piles of dead animals, chickens, cats, even a dog. Some were so decayed I couldn't even recognize what they were. Flies buzzed everywhere, and the ground was littered with bones and feathers. A makeshift fire pit in the center had blackened wood and something unidentifiable smoldering in it. My stomach churned, and I had to force myself to look away. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing. I spotted the gate on the other side of the yard and made a run for it. My hands fumbled with the latch, but I finally got it open and stumbled out onto the street. I didn't stop running until I was back at Ethan's house. When Ethan showed up a few minutes later, his face was pale and he was gasping for air. "Did they see you?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. He shook his head, but his hands were trembling. I told him everything, the smell, the dead animals, the fire pit. We sat there in silence, too scared to call the police, too scared to do anything but promise we'd never go near Riggs's house again. We never found out what Riggs was up to or why his backyard was filled with those horrors. My family moved away a few months later, and I didn't hear much about the old man after that. Ethan still lives in the neighborhood, though, and every now and then, when we talk, the subject comes up. "What do you think he was doing with all those animals?" Ethan asked me the last time we saw each other. I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't. But every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder how close we came to finding out. It was my 10th birthday, a day I had been looking forward to for months. The party was at this big park near our neighborhood, one of those places with sprawling green fields and a playground that seemed massive to my younger self. The morning had started with a drizzle, but by the time the party wrapped up, the rain had eased, leaving behind that fresh, earthy smell that always made everything feel brighter. My friends had brought all sorts of gifts, and my parents made sure we packed every last one into the car before heading home. The park had this fancy wrought iron gate at the exit, the kind that creaked a little when it moved. As we pulled out, the tires crunching on wet gravel, the car was filled with leftover balloons and my little brother complaining about not getting the first slice of cake. I was too happy to care. We reached the roundabout just outside the park and took the left turn toward the main highway. Everything seemed normal. Just another ride home after a fun day. It wasn't until we reached the crosswalk near our street that something odd happened. My dad, who was driving, glanced into the rearview mirror and frowned. It was one of those subtle moments, like when adults notice something but don't want to alarm anyone. He didn't say much, just mumbled something to my mom. She turned around to look, but didn't say anything either. I didn't think much of it at the time. When we pulled into our driveway, I hopped out, eager to get my presents inside and start unwrapping. But my dad didn't follow us in. Instead, he walked over to a red car that had stopped a little further down the street. I watched through the living room window as he leaned down to talk to the driver. It was a woman, maybe in her 30s, with sunglasses that reflected the setting sun. After what felt like forever, my dad came back inside. He didn't look angry, just uneasy. My mom asked him what the woman had said, and he shook his head. She told me, "I got what I wanted." That's all she said. That sentence stuck with me, even as my parents tried to brush it off. My dad called the police not long after. When the officer arrived, he listened to the story, nodding as my dad explained how he had noticed the woman filming us from her car as we left the park. She had followed us the entire way home, her phone pointed directly at us. The officer didn't seem overly concerned. He chalked it up to the rise of people using new gadgets like GoPros and smartphones to film everything. Probably just someone experimenting with their camera, he said. But even at 10 years old, I could tell my dad wasn't satisfied with that answer. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman had wanted something more than just random footage. What did she mean when she said, "I got what I wanted"? My parents tried to reassure me, saying it was probably nothing, but every time I saw a red car on our street, I'd feel my stomach tighten. We never saw the woman again, and life eventually returned to normal. Still, every now and then, I think back to that day and wonder, was she just some eccentric person with a camera? Or was there something more sinister behind her actions? I guess I'll never know, but that unease, that question of why, still lingers in the back of my mind. In 2017, I was living in Littleton, Colorado, and working at this fondue restaurant called The Melting Pot. It was in this ancient 3-story building that had a strange, almost magnetic pull. People said the place had a history. Back in the early 1900s, it was a library funded by Andrew Carnegie. Over the decades, it became other things, but the rumors never changed. There was something off about it. Paranormal TV crews had even done a show there once, calling it one of the most haunted spots in the state. The basement, though, that was a whole other level of creepy. It was a narrow L-shaped space with just 5 tables tucked into the shadows. To get down there, you had to descend these 2 shallow steps that always creaked, no matter how light your step was. To the left was a table for 4, and on the right, a small one for 2. Around the bend was a big round booth, and just past that were 2 more tables jammed into the dead end of the L. Everyone who worked there agreed that the last table in the corner had the worst energy. Guests would sometimes bring Ouija boards, daring the spirits to communicate. It felt like a challenge to something invisible lurking in the walls. One night I was stuck closing the basement with another server, a guy named Jared. He was a superstitious sort, always joking about ghosts but never wanting to be alone down there. We were clearing the last few tables when he suddenly winced. "Hey, did you just scratch me?" he asked, his voice sharp with panic. "What? No," I said, baffled. He lifted the back of his shirt, and there they were, 3 deep red scratches cutting across his skin. They were fresh, too, with tiny beads of blood starting to form. Jared went pale, muttered something about quitting, and walked out for good a week later. That should have been enough to convince me, but it wasn't. I was skeptical, even after seeing those marks. I couldn't shake the idea that it was all in his head. Or maybe mine. So, that same night when the place was empty except for me, I did something stupid. Standing in that corner, I shouted, "Come on, if you're real, do something, show me." My voice echoed in the quiet basement. I laughed at myself and went back to clearing tables, convinced nothing was going to happen. I grabbed a tub full of dirty dishes and started up the stairs toward the kitchen. Just as I passed the infamous corner, I heard this metallic clang. A heavy fondue pot had somehow leapt out of the tub and tumbled down the stairs behind me. I froze. The air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I turned back to pick up the pot, my heart pounding harder than I cared to admit. As soon as I stepped into the corner, I felt it. Something cold and forceful grabbed my shirt sleeve. Before I could react, I was yanked sideways and slammed into the rough stone wall. Pain exploded in my head and I staggered, barely catching myself. I touched my forehead and felt something wet. My fingers came away slick with blood. Panicked, I stumbled into the bathroom to check the damage. In the mirror, I saw a nasty gash about 3 inches long across my forehead, already swelling into a lump. My shirt sleeve was torn where I'd been grabbed. I couldn't explain it. The fondue pot, the invisible hand, the way I'd been thrown into the wall. It all felt impossible. But the blood on my face was real enough. After that night, I stopped teasing whatever was down there. I didn't quit like Jared did, but I never stayed in the basement alone again. Even now, I think back to that corner and feel a chill. If there's one thing I learned from that experience, it's this. Don't provoke what you don't understand. Some things don't need proof. They make themselves known in their own terrifying way. Back when I was in college, I met a guy who seemed to be a little out of place. He was older than the usual students, a bit of a mystery to most people, but he was talented, really talented, especially with music. He wasn't part of my circle of friends, but we'd see each other around campus, especially during the scholarship meetings I was in. We weren't close, but we'd nod in passing or chat briefly when our paths crossed. He had this calm but distant vibe, and I never thought too much of it. Everyone has their quirks, right? One Saturday night, I bumped into him at a 24-hour grocery store not far from campus. I was just picking up a few things, my mind elsewhere, when I saw him standing by the snack aisle. He seemed different, though. His usual calm was gone, and his eyes, there was something in them that made me pause. I said hello and we started chatting casually. But then, out of nowhere, he began to cry. Quietly at first, but then his voice broke. He told me how much he'd liked me for so long, how he'd admired me from afar, but knew it was wrong because I was in a relationship. I stood there frozen, unsure of how to respond. It felt like we were in some strange, private moment, surrounded by shelves of chips and cereal boxes. He went on, spilling details about his life, his struggles with his family, how he felt misunderstood and alone. For what seemed like forever, I just listened. I had no idea what to say to comfort him. But I stayed there, trying to be kind. I kept repeating that I was already with someone and that there was no chance for us. He had to understand that. But I also told him he was a good person and that he shouldn't be so hard on himself. I figured that was the best I could do, and I hoped he'd find some peace. That's when the conversation took a turn. He told me something that chilled me to my core. He said one night he came by my apartment, and the door was unlocked. He didn't say how or why he even thought it was okay to go inside, but he did. He said he wandered around for a while, trying to figure out which bedroom was mine. He couldn't remember, but instead of leaving, he stayed in the living room, lingering there for a while. He sounded almost proud of the fact that he'd been in my space without me even knowing. I felt sick to my stomach. At some point during our talk, I don't even remember when, he tried to kiss me. I was so stunned I barely reacted in time. I turned my head so he only kissed my cheek, but it didn't matter. I didn't know how to handle it. Everything about the situation felt wrong. It wasn't just his confession or his invasion of my personal space. It was the way he didn't seem to realize how disturbing it all was. As if things weren't complicated enough, my boyfriend showed up at the store. He saw what happened, saw me in that uncomfortable, awkward situation, and walked away in anger. It wasn't until later, when we both calmed down, that he came back to make sure I was okay. It felt like a long, quiet ride home, with neither of us really knowing what to say. The next day I got a message from the musician. It was a simple text, but the words still hit me hard. He said, "I can't believe what happened last night. I was crying. There's something about you that I love, but I'm scared of getting hurt." Everything I said was true. He told me he needed to speak to me, but I didn't want to hear it. I'd had enough. I went to the scholarship staff, told them everything. I felt uneasy about him, like he might show up again or try something else. I asked them to make sure we were never alone together, just in case. I wanted to feel safe again. I didn't think about him for a long time after that. Over 2 years passed and I moved on. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from him. It was on my birthday. I stared at it, feeling a mix of confusion and dread. How could he have remembered? I thought I'd removed him from my social media a long time ago. I checked, and sure enough, I had. I didn't even get birthday reminders anymore because I'd cut him off from my life completely. But there it was. His message still sitting in my inbox, as if he'd never left. I blocked him immediately. There was no reason to leave any door open, no reason to let him back in. I had to make it clear once and for all. There would be no more contact. Not in my space, not in my life, not ever again.